Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 88th of the COVID Calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, we have a discussion about mapping and the pandemic. You can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube Live. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USofDisaster or @COVIDCalls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, July 22nd, 2020, there are 15,008,046 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 14,774,887 cases reported yesterday. Of those, 3,919,550 are in the United States. That's up from 3,858,686 reported yesterday. There are now a total of 142,350 deaths reported in the United States. That's up from 141,426 reported yesterday. Well, we have a wonderful program today and a lot of interaction planned and several guests. So I want to get right to that. And so I'm going to introduce my first two guests who are going to be helping to facilitate the session today. And then we have four other guests who are going to be participating. And this is going to be a unique COVID Calls in that we're going to have participation from those of you who are listening or watching at a distance, and even ask you to send us some of your work throughout this hour. So really looking forward to that. I'm going to jump right into the introductions. And let me just bring my first two participants in here. Let me introduce Yanni first. Yanni Alexander Loukisas is Associate Professor of Digital Media in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech, where he directs the local data design lab. His new book, All Data Are Local: Thinking Critically in a Data-Driven Society, is a great book, and it's addressed to a growing audience of practitioners who want to work with unfamiliar sources both effectively and ethically. He is also the author of Co-Designers, Cultures of Computer Simulation in Architecture, came out with Routledge in 2012, and co-editor of the Digital STS Handbook. He's taught at Cornell, MIT, and the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, originally trained as an architect at Cornell. He attended MIT, where he received a Master's of Science and a PhD in Design and Computation, and he completed postdoctoral work at the MIT program in Science, Technology, and Society. My second guest is Jer Thorpe. Jer is an artist, writer, and teacher living in New York City, best known for designing the algorithm to place the nearly 3,000 names on the 9/11 memorial in Manhattan. Jer was the New York Times first data artist in residence. He's a National Geographic explorer, and in 2017 and 2018, he served as the innovator in residence at the Library of Congress. Jer is one of the world's foremost data artists and is a leading voice for the ethical use of big data. His data-inspired artwork has been shown around the world, including most recently in Times Square, at the Museum of Modern Art, and at the Ars Electronica Center in Austria, as well as the National Seoul Museum in Korea. Jer is a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow and alumnus of the World Economic Foundation's Global Agenda Council on Design and Innovation. He's also an adjunct professor at NYU's Interactive Telecommunication Program and is the co-founder of the Office for Creative Research. And he has a book out as well, just out this year, Living in Data. So Jer and Yanni, thanks so much for coming on COVID Calls today.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Before I bring on our other four participants today, let me just briefly get a sense from each of you where you're calling in from and what the COVID-19 pandemic situation is there. Yanni, can I start with you?
I'm right under the Manhattan Bridge, so I'm in Brooklyn. We are in a much different state than we were 6 weeks ago. It's it's starting to feel something like normal here, although I'm not sure what that means. That's a very strange word. But there was one point where I would go out and sit under the bridge in the evening and just watch the ambulances stream by along the FDR, and that is no longer the case. So we're hoping for as long of an easing as we can get.
I'm teaching a course, believe it or not, a history course on COVID-19. And today we talked about the month of April, Jer. And I mean, it already, of course, seems like a long time ago, but just what you described, and some of those images from April are just absolutely arresting, and how quickly, in my mind at least, I had put some of that behind me. It's extraordinary, and I'm glad that it's turned the corner there. Thanks for sharing that. Yanni, let me turn to you. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Atlanta, Georgia. Very different scene down here. I'm calling from a room behind my fireplace, you can see, where I've been at home with my partner and two small kids for many months now, and it's been a different way of life here. We've gone through a different trajectory, I'll say, than New York saw. I think early on we thought, we had somehow dodged the bullet, but things have really shifted, and Georgia is now one of the states with the highest number of cases. And we have a governor that's in complete denial, trying to open up our university system here that I'm faculty at, and we're really struggling to figure out what are the next couple of months going to look like, and how do we prevent more escalation.
So I've known you guys not too long, just a couple of years. We started work together. Was looking to do a project with some other colleagues on the Anthropocene, and we wanted to do a project in St. Louis. And I sort of put out the bat signal to Twitter, and I said, who knows anything about mapping and geography in St. Louis? And the answer came back, Map Room, which quickly turned up you guys. And that's how I first found you. And so characteristically in our interactions, I've come up with some kind of idea that I thought was a wild idea, and you immediately said, absolutely, let's work on this. So thanks for joining today for this discussion. And I want to bring in, we have a panel of participants who are going to be with us today. So let me bring them in. Screen is now crowded with mappers, and let's get some introductions if we could. We'll just go around. Shivani, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, hey you guys. My name's Shivani, and I'm calling in from Fearless Hills, Pennsylvania, which is like a suburb of Philadelphia. It's about like 40 minutes away, and I'm a rising second year student at Drexel, and I'm studying finance and econ. I'm really excited to be here with you guys today.
Thanks. And we have Chris.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris. I'm also calling in from New York City. I am currently getting my master's in urban planning from NYU, and I work at the Department of City Planning here, where I've been doing some pandemic response work as well. So this is all really relevant and timely.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And let's talk to Bucky Stanton.
Hi, folks. My name's Bucky Stanton. I'm a graduate student in science technology studies up near Albany. It's a city called Troy, New York. And I study archaeology and resource politics. And I also help Scott with a few things.
Great. Thank you, Bucky. And Rhea.
Hi, I'm Rhea. I'm a rising senior at Princeton. I'm studying human-computer interaction and design, and I'm calling from right outside of Atlanta, so similar experience to Yanni.
Thank you, all of you, for making time for this today. And we will have people watching and sending questions and comments, and as those come in, I'll put them up on the screen. So now we're all about to get very small on your screen, as I think Yanni's going to take control, and I'm going to bring in to the frame here some discussion of what the map room is and your approach to data and mapping, and then helping us think through a little bit about what COVID-19 is from a geographical and psychogeographical perspective. So let me bring that up on the screen there. And Yanni, I think you have it.
Thank you. Well, we're going to start really hands-on. And I'd like to actually pass it to Jer here, who's going to take you through a little tool that he built just in the last couple of days to help you all make some maps at home. And we're hoping that as we talk, you can be drawing, and before the hour is out, maybe you'll share some of that with us. So Jer?
Yeah, sure. So I just made this, I should call it a tool / experiment, because we just threw it together really quickly with the hopes that people will have a base on which to start drawing some maps, because mapping is going to be so central to what we're talking about today. So if you go and visit that site, yeah, you'll see just a really simple mapping tool, and you can use the search bar to enter in an address. And what you want to do is just get an area on the screen that you think you're going to want to draw your map in. As to what that map can be, that's really up to you. I started drawing one. It's a map of the area around me. I put some red crosses down there by the bottom. That's where the ambulances were parked when I would go for my birding walk in the morning in the park. And I've just been adding some notes as we've been talking. And so there's actually kind of two things we want to do today as far as maps are concerned: to start talking about a map as an individual way to help document and maybe understand your pandemic experience, but then to think about maps as instruments to read other types of data. And then I said two things, but there's three. And the third thing is to think about maps as a way to bring ourselves together and to think about shared experience. So I can use somebody else's map to understand how their pandemic experience might have been different than mine. And that could be a geographic difference, it could be a demographic difference, it could be an age difference, could be all kinds of differences. And that's what we want to get people doing. I don't want people to feel too much pressure about using the map tool right now. You can always go back later and build one of these maps. But what we'd love to do is get a collection of maps that people have built with this tool that we can start overlaying with each other, that we can start combining with data, and do some fun things with. But for now, really all you need is a piece of paper and something to draw with. I brought my crayons, and I've got some pencils and all kinds of things to draw with.
Terrific. I can try to share that screen so people can get a sense of what the interface looks like. Let me see if I can do that real quick. Share screen. Select, and I'm going to do.
No, you do need a printer, which Yanni and I were saying. Maybe printers are kind of rare technology. So again, if you want to just do it without the interface, you can think about your neighborhood around you, or even your apartment, or something like that you might want to just start to draw. I love it just to be thinking about using it as a note-taking experience while we're talking, and we'll get into more detail about what we'd like to do with the maps as we move forward.
Oh, here it is. Okay. You guys seeing this?
We still see you.
Okay. Here it is.
There
okay.
we go.
You can see there's some instructions on the side. It says, and this is our suggestion for how you might go about making a map. Search to use the search tool to find your home. So if I put in like Atlanta, Georgia, here, this will take me in here. Let's see if it takes a little while to. Okay, so I'm starting to recognize Atlanta. Here's I-20, I-75, 85. And you start to get a street grid, and then you can just orient this and find the extents that you want for the map. And this is going to be the base layer. And, if you do kind of Control P, you can just print this and then use it as a base for drawing your own paths and adding things that you want to add, labels, or even, you can put start to kind of paste stuff on there if you want, and get your own map. So,
yeah, and when you print it out, there's a little QR code that prints out.
yes.
And we'll use that eventually to kind of align these things and add some data on top of them.
So go ahead and try it out as we're talking, and we're going to get going with the rest of our discussion here. And feel free to ping us if you're having trouble. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to back to our presentation here.
Yeah, Scott, it's interesting that you start your episodes with this listing of data, and it's been a spring of data. And as somebody who's been working with data for years and years and years, one of the reasons I came to the map room was to try to think about more personal ways to explore data. So this project came out of a long residency that I did in St. Louis, which at the time started off as a really open-ended residency with an organization called COCA in St. Louis. And then what happened partway through my residency is that Michael Brown was shot in St. Louis, just out in one of the sub-cities of St. Louis. And the city became this place that was really centered around issues about racial justice and investigating these deep inequities that had been historically such a big part of that. And so I kind of discarded any ideas I had that I was going to work on some type of data artwork, and instead thought, okay, let's make a place where people can come together and talk about their experiences in the city centered around data.
So this is really the driving question, I think, for us that's kind of helped the project to move forward. How do we create spaces in which people can examine, challenge, and redefine the stories that they feel data are telling about their lives and the places they live? And how can they bring data into a dialogue with their own lived experiences? And maybe Jared can talk a little bit about how this unfolded in St. Louis, and then we can tell you about how it's subsequently moved to other places and taken different and new forms.
Yeah, so the idea of the map room actually came from two things. It was this kind of this cultural artifact of the space where lots of people would be gathered around a large table, like usually in wartime. They would be able to be using this map as a kind of means of dialogue. And central to my understanding of that was the scale of these maps. Like, all of us interact with maps, but now more than ever they're small. And so I wanted to think about what it means for people to convene around larger maps. And a friend of mine, Patrick Meyer, who some of you in the disaster world may know, did some work post a large earthquake in Nepal. And he showed some pictures that he'd done in Nepal of bringing these gigantic photographs of the disaster area to the people who lived in these communities as a way to sort of, for them to think about how things should happen as far as the recovery is concerned. So when we built MapRoom, it was really thinking about bringing people together. These are convenings. And then we were thinking about scale. So you can see this is an old gymnasium. The maps themselves are 10 feet by 10 feet. There's 31 of them hanging in the gymnasium. And they just offer you this really social scale to deal with maps. And you can see some pictures of people there on their hands and knees drawing. And so while they're drawing, it becomes a way for them to think, they don't have to worry about getting in somebody else's way. And then when people are convening around the maps again, it's just a much different experience than trying to look over somebody's shoulder on their laptop. And so that's really one of the big things we were trying to do. And I always thought about MapRoom, especially in this case, as a way to, it's like a machine for changing perspective. So when I come into the MapRoom, I might look at a certain data set only from my perspective. But when I bring a map down that's made by ninth graders, or a map that's made by people who might be homeless, or a map that's made by city workers, I automatically see the city through a different lens than I would have before, and therefore I see the data sets in a different way than I would have before. And so what we did is, as well as building the space and making curricula for the schools, and hiring a really awesome facilitator, Emily Catedral, who did a lot of work with us. We also did this kind of what I call the data liberation task, which was, can we get all of these different data sets about the city and put them in one place so that people can overlay them on top of the maps that they've drawn? So you can see that this includes historical maps, sort of contemporary civic information, and then lots and lots and lots of different data layers that we put on top. And so the experience of the map room, if you're a map maker, was that you come and make this map, and it usually takes a few hours. It can take up to a day, and then you can go through these layers and help understand how the city is changing. And then if you're a visitor to the map room, you can come in and take a map that somebody else has made and do the same thing with these map layers. And so this became what we found, and what a lot of people told us, was it was this place where they could speak about issues that maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable talking about in another setting, because you had this data in front of you that you might not use as God's truth. I hope you don't use it as God's truth, but it's a reference point. It's something for people to kind of meet on. I always say that it's like a dinner party, but it's like a data party. And we know that dinner parties can get heated, and the conversation can get really engaged, and that's the same thing we saw in St. Louis with the map room. So this is my favorite map. It was made by a group of ninth graders from a school called Brittany Woods, and they made a map of all the places in their neighborhood that they felt were safe, and then they colored it by who felt safe there. So you can see the little key that they made. They say these are some spaces that the Black students in the classroom felt safe. Here's the places where the white students in the classroom felt safe. Here's some places that everybody feels safe. And so this was a really interesting map, because then we could use all kinds of different data layers on top of it to investigate why is that the case? So why do you feel safer in these places? And actually what the students really got obsessed with were these redlining maps from the 1930s. And so what they saw is that when they projected these redlining maps that were drawn 80 years ago, those boundaries still existed in their neighborhoods. And this kind of it just blew these kids' minds. And actually they went back to their school and they did a whole project about redlining, where they put posters up in their hallways and in their neighborhood to try to get people to understand what the legacies of these racist decisions were almost a century later.
Jared, I just want to linger on that point for a second. This is Scott.
Yeah.
That to me is such a powerful act, that these maps, particularly the ubiquity with which we can pull up pretty detailed maps on our devices now, but that when you introduce that historical layer, those students will never look at any map probably the same way again. We had that same experience in Philadelphia around the work of geographer, historian named Ann Whiston Spurn, who did a project about the Mill Creek neighborhood in Philadelphia. And that's where a lot of public housing was cited, and they had continual environmental problems there. And she demonstrated, again, the sort of redlining map, and she demonstrated, hey, some of these housing projects are built on top of subsiding land, and it's desolate, it's on a creek. And it initiated a whole set of questions about, well, who would decide to put a building there? Oh, I see. They put buildings there because certain people they expected to live there. And it was a cascade that led to, and I'll let people, I'll let you keep going. But I mean, that historical layer and the geographical layer of history is a tremendously powerful tool.
Yeah, and then you add this mark that you've made on the map, right? It's like it's made with your hand too. And I'm somebody who for almost 3 decades now have really worked almost purely in digital media. So what I found here was there, like, there's this visceral experience of like drawing on a map is something that helps you connect to those data differently than you would have before. And then just to kind of bring back this word, which I'm obsessed with this project of convening, right? It's like, it's not one person like clicking on an iPad. It's you know, sometimes 10, sometimes 12, sometimes 6 people in a room that are having these real dialogues. And so here's some of the maps which we don't see in full detail, but you can see the styles of the maps are all very different. You can do all kinds of things. We kind of left it open to people. So some people really painted their maps and they put handprints on it. And then other people really meticulously put notes. You can see one of them has photographs. And that to me was really exciting. Like, can we give people some expressivity in the way that they're building their own tools to interact with data? And I think Yanni will get to this a little bit later, but one of the things we maybe were surprised to discover through MapRoom was that it really is a great instrument for people to be critical about data. So more and more, as the project unfolded, we realized that this was a great tool for people to say, whoa, this data set isn't right, or the story that's being told about this data set isn't correct, or I don't like the colors you're showing on this data set. You know, I don't like that the city's data set around poverty like uses red as the color for poverty. Like, what does that mean? And so it was this really nice way to just get people to realize that like data is not necessarily this thing that is etched in stone. It can be questioned, it can be changed, and more as we're working on MapRoom, we're asking people to develop their own data sets, and that's a question we'll come back to later.
And just to add on to that, what's really powerful about these maps that you're looking at is people from around St. Louis, whether they were middle school kids or longtime residents, you know, they're drawing maps of the places they live. And what better subject is there to start to have a perspective, a critical perspective on data, because this is data about a place you know. So you are very well situated to then say, hey, there's something missing here. Often, I think we're looking at data sets about other places and other times, a situation someone else is in. And this is how the MapRoom sets people up to really say, actually, I know something that's not in the data set. I have something to add here, and they do so. You know, obviously, it should go without saying that I saw this project and was kind of blown away by it. You know, up until this point, I hadn't been involved in the project. I found out about this. I knew Jer kind of informally through conferences and things, and I reached out to him because it spoke to me on a number of levels. You know, I'd been doing data visualization for years, but something I had always lamented is, I was trained as an architect originally, and architects love to draw. I've been drawing all my life, and here was somebody who had figured out how to connect data to drawing. And I wanted to be a part of that and work on it with Jer. And so we really tried to.
Yanni, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Can you put that back to one slide? I just wanted to show. I wanted to show two things and then talk about one thing. So the map on the far left that's in the middle, you'll notice that map is reversed, and that was a decision that the map makers made. They were like, we want to turn the map sideways so that people will be kind of disrupted by the way that they read it. And then you'll see that there's that map on the far right, which they kind of did the same thing. They wanted it to be turned so that people would question their idea of what the relationship between East St. Louis and the main St. Louis city is. And then I should say that there are two other maps that were made that had information in them that people didn't feel like they wanted to make public. They were okay that people could come into the map room and see them because it was a kind of intimate space, but they didn't want them to be on the web. One of them was made by a group that serves homeless people, and they had some safe places on that map that weren't known by the city officials. They were not legal sort of sanctuaries. So this is a really interesting thing to us too, to talk about like what kind of knowledge can be built into these map room exercises in this intimate space that isn't on the internet, that is in the map room, that maybe people would not be willing to discuss somewhere else.
Terrific. Well, I'm gonna try to breeze through a bunch more slides that show you other iterations of the map room that Jared and I have worked on together, and that we've worked on with Chris and Rhea, who've been really generous to join us here today. Yeah.
Yanni, let me just remind people as you're going into that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're having a special discussion today about mapping and the pandemic. So we're hearing about the work of Jared Thorpe and Yanni Loukissas in their map room and other collaborative projects. And while people are seeing this, we have our in-house group that's also mapping, and those of you at home or wherever you are can also, if you just go to, I'm gonna put it back up on the screen, the site where you can go to do your own mapping. And then, so go ahead, Yanni, let's make sure we leave some time. We're going to end at about 6:05 today, so we'll leave time for people to share what they did.
Yeah.
We got 2
ahead.
maps
Thank you.
already, by the way. Thanks to Jorge and Robert, who both sent in their maps already, which is exciting. Very
Great.
cool to see.
So I
Awesome.
think this kind of sums up our thinking about how the map room could expand to other places. It really becomes an exercise in creating a number of local spaces where people can creatively and collaboratively explore data. The first place we tried this is in Atlanta, and this is a shot of a bunch of students at Georgia Tech drawing a map on a system that Chris really led the work to build this map room, and it looks very different from the map room in St. Louis. First of all, it's not a square format. It's long, it's thin. It's actually 16 feet long and 4 feet wide. And using this kind of format, we could draw these kind of transects through the city. And we use this to draw maps of things like the Beltline that some of you might be familiar with. Urban renewal project that's happening in Atlanta that's stirred a lot of controversy. And in order to enable this linear map room to work, Chris kind of ingeniously figured out how to mount a projector on a rail above that moves back and forth and constantly signaling the computer kind of where it is. So it's updating the image below. And we made some really incredible maps together. You can see a detail. Students took photographs and layered those onto the map, and they added data. They were investigating questions like, how does the Beltline related to gentrification that's happening in Atlanta? Where as this new kind of infrastructure was being built, the cost of property was going up and people are being displaced. And of course, this has all kinds of racial implications as well. Here's a little diagram of what the map room looked like in Atlanta. Then Rhea came on board and we started working on a very different kind of map room. You know, a lot of people started asking, how could we bring the map room to them? We want to set up a map room, and Scott was one of those folks. And so we were like, well, we built this whole apparatus and it's kind of bolted to the ceiling. So we started working on a portable version, which we call MapSpot. And here you can see it's set up at a conference. And we basically took a short throw projector and turned it 90 degrees and just put it on a tripod. And you can turn any table into a mapping surface. So there you can see the projection. This is in New Orleans. People are drawing their walks around the city. You know, we had, I think, probably about 50 people drew various walks they took around New Orleans. And then you can turn on data sets that would start to show their walks in relationship to things like median income in the city, or the percentage of college-educated residents. Now, this is all data from the American Community Survey, or the percentage of white occupants in those census tracts. And of course, you know, you might have figured that these kinds of demographics relate a lot to gentrification. These are different indicators of gentrification. And you can see how people walk in and out of different zones which are actively gentrifying in New Orleans. Most recently, we brought the map room to Savannah, where we've worked with people like, on the left, you see Dr. McLean, who's an environmental justice activist who started a center called the Harumba House on the west side of Savannah. And she's gotten together with Kim Cobb, who's on the right, who's a climate scientist at Georgia Tech. And they're looking at sea level rise and how it's impacting residents across the Savannah region. The project has installed a bunch of sea level sensors. So here you can see one on a bridge in Savannah. At the top of the bridge in the center is Russ Clark, who's one of the leading data scientists on the project. And they're getting data like this. You know, but of course, what's really interesting is when we put it on a map, here's all the sensors that that the project has installed around Savannah. And this kind of data can be incorporated into models to look at things like inundation levels. So, you know, where does the water go and how is that going to change over time? You know, so here's current inundation, and by the end of the century, climate scientists are predicting that sea level rise could be up to 10 feet in Savannah. This is what that would look like. So you can imagine that this becomes a rich context for people to then draw their own experiences and where, you know, where are they seeing flooding? How is it affecting their lives? And we're doing this in schools, but also in community centers. Of course, you know, as we're planning all of this, the pandemic hit, and you know, I end up in my basement with this device, figuring out, okay, well, how does the map room now work? You know, when we can't get together, we can't convene. Can you draw a map on your own? And of course, I experimented with trying to draw some maps by myself. I took a lot of walks during this period with my two young kids, Felix and Sonia, kind of around the neighborhood. They have a lot of energy, they need to get out. So I've kind of been thinking about how to map that, taking photographs of, you know, how my neighborhood is changing. But I think we're really excited. You know, in a way, the pandemic presents all kinds of new challenges, from new subjects and new data for the map room to contend with, but also new constraints like social distancing. And so I think we would like to use the remainder of the time to talk about what does the map room mean for how we might reflect on the pandemic, and what does the pandemic mean for how the map room has to continue to transform and be something new for people who find themselves in new places, both spatially and emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, it might be good to see if our studio audience either has some maps that they've started to make, or, you know, there's two questions that Yanni and I would love to put out to the group at large, so people who are watching as well as in the room. And one is, so wherever you live, what are the data sets that you would love to be able to sort of put on top of the maps you're drawing? And then second, who would you like to see make a map? Like, whose life would you like to see in your city? So we can use those as framing questions for our guests, and if whoever wants to jump in and talk about maybe what they've been thinking about with mapping and the pandemic and any of those questions, that would be great to hear from you.
Well, I've been trying to use a screen grab. I don't have a printer, but I've been using a screen grab of my local area in Troy. And I've been trying to map where I feel safe and where I don't feel safe. And I've noticed that all the areas I don't feel safe are commercial areas. Basically, they're the main throughways. They're the gentrified areas of the town. And that gets me thinking to your question that I would love to see, because Troy's a kind of small town near Albany. It's dominated commercially by a couple, central nodal characters who have capital, who, kind of block by block scoop up and gentrify places or build things in the area. And I'd love to see a map of their, like, where they're going, because they're very visible in town. These certain characters, I don't want to out them or anything, but what's their relationship in spreading the pandemic, since they own restaurants, they own bars, they own these things, and they have an incentivization to stay open, and that the commercial density areas are where I don't feel safe.
One thing that I noticed was, like, that first came to my mind on how this could be useful is, so like since the beginning, since like March, I've been really privileged to, be at home and like have everything. So I've just kind of been thinking of ways that how I can like kind of give back to my community without, having to actually be somewhere. So recently, my township, they've been doing like a virtual food drive, and basically like on their Facebook, they put up a Facebook post saying, if anyone has like any non-perishable foods they'd like to donate, just leave them outside your house, and we'll come pick them up with a non-contact pickup. And like one immediate like thought that came to my head was, how cool would it be if we could use if a community could use MapRoom to be like, hey, look, I have some non-perishable foods here that I like to donate, and like it'd be really useful. There's something that came to mind for my community. But yeah.
Yeah, I think about where I'm interacting with maps right now, and I realize it's mostly through Strava, which is like the cycling and running app. And when you start to track your runs, or if you plan a run or cycle, you can see like a heat map of like where people are traveling. I think the biggest thing that I've realized through my experience with my friends and family is like people are restricted more and more to different areas based off where they live. If they live in a city with more or less green space, or even just now in my area, seeing where people are choosing to run, why do certain neighborhood streets have more traffic here, and kind of what that might be an indicator of. I think that could be a really interesting layer to add on to the Mapbox or MapSpot.
Yeah, that's this concept of scale, I think, is one of the things that we wanted to build into MapRoom from the beginning. And you'll see in St. Louis that some people map literally a block, and other people map the whole Metro St. Louis area. And so for me, I've been really thinking about scale. Like, I think all of our worlds have dramatically shrunk. Like how does mapping operate to show that? And so I think one of the questions I have about MapRoom, which we really haven't talked about much, is how does people's kind of how does the mapping exercise bind with time? So can I maybe make a series of maps that show like March 26th and April 26th and May 26th and June 26th, and kind of how my life has changed over that time? I think that's it, and that's a question that kind of relates to what everybody has said already.
That was exactly what I was thinking about. I wish we had been able to do this exercise right before the pandemic, because especially with like a breakdown of transportation options and other factors that are restricting us. I know personally, at least my sense of like home and location has been skewed pretty quickly by just the way that my life has changed. But on top of that too, I just think it's the impacts of COVID have been so tied to geography that's something I would love to spend a ton of time unpacking, because every time you see any sort of like data set about this, everyone always wants to know what it looks like when it's mapped, because they know that there will be disparities geographically because so many other social factors are tied in. So I'd love to do more exercises to give, one layer deeper than just like the number of deaths by zip code, because there's only so much we can learn from that, to really see how the pandemic has affected people geographically depending on where they live.
I think kind of going off of that, seeing where where COVID is hitting geographically also makes us realize where pre-existing conditions, like we talk about these pre-existing medical conditions, these will already geographically dependent. And I think that raises a big question of why are certain areas more prone to X or to Y? And that can really pull out that kind of a question.
We've also been interested in not only looking to the past, but to the future. Like, can maps be made that are speculative, and what might those maps look like? And for me, with when Yanni and I have been talking about this, is that you have those really central data layers that make sense for COVID, like how many cases per block or per zip code, as you were saying. But then there's these other data sets that this condition of quarantine have made more visible. And Yanni was talking about, he brings his kids out to play in all these waterways, and he wants to know how polluted those waterways are. And that's something that you might not have considered before. Like, the pandemic has changed your view of that. For me, it's like I became a birder during the pandemic. So now I read my neighborhood through birds, and that's like something that's completely changed for me. And even though those things may seem kind of trivial and quotidian, those are the types of things that MapRoom serves very well, as opposed to these, I think, quite blunt data maps that you typically see that don't capture a lot of nuance.
I think that's a great point, Jer. We're all seeing our neighborhoods in new ways. We're maybe spending a lot more time in them. We're moving through them differently. I think one of the funny things that this creek issue brought up for me, because of course I'm like, oh, should I let my kids kind of wade in this creek? And of course I went looking for data about those creeks, and of course it reinforced everything I should have known, which is that data is available, but it's not necessarily accessible. Like, it's a lot of stuff on different kinds of bacteria, in units that I don't understand, and reinforcing this sense that, there's a lot of data out there about the places we live, but it's kind of inscrutable, a lot of it. And we need better ways of, not just putting those data into dialogue with our lived experience, but also learning the context around those data. And I think that the MapRoom used to be a space in which you'd get together with experts. When I would get in the MapRoom with Tim Cobb, and she would talk about, what do these sensor readings on sea level mean? That was incredibly helpful, but without, somebody there to fill in that context, it's really hard to know what to make of the numbers. And, we're seeing this, every day in the news as well, of course. There's lots of data about the pandemic, but there are just as many different ways of interpreting it, So I think that's a persistent challenge.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It brings us back to this idea that experiencing data is a lonely thing. Usually, it's usually you, and not anybody else. And so, I think one of Yanni and I's open questions is, certainly in a context like this, which I think we've all been familiar with lately, in a Zoom room with breakouts, you can get close to something where you have a collaborative experience. But how can we make that closer to that word convening, and how can we bring that kind of dinner party aspect of it back? For me, I question things like duration. So MapRoom was open for 6 weeks in St. Louis, which was really important to us. It meant that people could get there who might not otherwise be able to do so because their lives are more chaotic or more differently structured than ours. And so, how do we maintain some of those things that really work for MapRoom and not have it actually be in a gymnasium?
I think we can declare this MapRoom is open and can remain open for a while. I want to remind people listening to COVID Calls, and you can see the link here, and I'll make sure we can tweet out the link and keep that available for folks. But just based on this conversation we're having, I'm seeing so many different dimensions of this that also helps me think about. So one of the insights that has come, I think, from disaster research at this time is the importance that we don't treat the pandemic and the racial violence and the economic collapse separately, but we think about them in an aggregate, and we think about the relationships among those three, so that it becomes something more complicated on purpose so that we don't make it less complicated and therefore our response isn't as robust as it could be. When you add on, just listening to this great conversation, this sort of mapping layer, which to me, in a sense, stands in for the desire to acquire data and knowledge for safety in the middle of the disaster, which quite often is a problem in disaster research more generally. Like, how do I find out where the water is or isn't? How do I find out where the fire is or isn't? Often that kind of data gathering is very quick and its utility is pretty short-lived. But you're describing the formation of maps right now, which will have a utility for many months, if not how long, until a vaccine, and longer than that. And I'm not sure we've seen anything like that, but it's another sort of layer of information that's necessary for a disaster response. I mean, public officials who are trying to understand and manage this disaster still manage it very much the way you all have described, like, well, what county is safe and what county is not safe. That is not adequate in this time at all, either in terms of knowing where danger is, but also maybe where repair is, or where solidarity is, where community is. We need a lot more of this kind of work to move it into that space, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And when Yanni and I talked about this discussion, I think one of the things that made me sort of hesitant was that I don't want people to think about this exercise of mapping that has to happen within this hour. In fact, it shouldn't happen within this hour. It should happen over the course of days and longer. It could be something that you come back to months from now with some insight that you hadn't discovered, and that's something that I think we would love. I think what we're trying to do as a first step here is to imagine exactly that. Can we make these kind of open-ended map rooms, but then get these little points where we can come together and meet around and discuss these things? Because what we'd love to do with these maps that everybody's making is to put them into and kind of overlay them on top of one another in an interface that then allows you to do some of those things about being critical and reading through data, and then to come back together and talk about them. That's like what we'd let, I guess, in an ideal scale, that's what it would look like.
Are we at a point where we can see some of the maps that have been made in this, like a cooking show? This is what we were saying before. Now that we've been talking, we're going to produce the...
I saw that some of you all made maps. You want to hold them up or just tell us about them?
Or you can share screen if it's on your screen.
I have
Who
one.
wants to go first?
I have one.
Rhea, you're going first?
Let's see if I can do this. It's on my iPad, so I don't know if you guys can see that. Okay, you guys kind of. Okay, cool. So this is where I am. You can see the kind of a purple line. That's all the places that I've been biking and walking near me. It has not been fun. It's very hilly here, so it's been interesting. And then I also highlighted all the water because I'm spending my time by water. It's very calming to me, and I've been swimming in some of the lakes. And then all of the yellow spots are kind of the places that I have spent significant time. So there's my house. There's the spot by the lake that I go to. The long one is the Kroger, where I go grocery shopping. And the one down at the bottom is the ice cream store, Brewster's. So there's a photo of one of my runs by the lake. This is kind of where my world has been. So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
Can you think about, like, what if you could put a data set on top of that? What would you be interested in seeing? Either a static one or a time-based one?
That's really interesting. I think I would love to see the map layer that we already have % white occupancy. This is not the area that I grew up in necessarily. I'm staying with family, and given everything with like Black Lives Matter, it's been very interesting to be in a much more white space through all of this. And so I think that'd be interesting to kind of visualize that, like with the different shaded regions, kind of where I'm staying. And then versus where I've lived, like at school at Princeton, or before I went to school, to kind of compare how that feels in this time.
Yeah, and so one challenge I would give you, because we don't really understand what that looks like, is like, what does a notation look like for that map? Like, is it on the map? Is it separate from the map? Is it written? Is it spoken? This is something that I think we're trying to understand in this new kind of virtual map room, about how these things do get, like what you just said, essentially. How does that get attached to the map such that when somebody looks at it, they can understand that? In the kind of physical space, people chat around it, and so what does that mean when we can't be together at the same time?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I can see the shades. Like in an ideal world, it'd be really awesome if I could put on my like AR goggles and like see different layers rise up with different things. There's lots of different ways I think you could bring that to life at home.
Thanks, Rhea. It really brings to mind one of the things I think we've lost in this moment, which is normally in the map room, you get to draw your route for the space of your life, and then you see where it intersects with other people's experience, other people's routines, and I think it's very hard to do that now. We're hoping that we can collect these maps and do some of that digitally, but it's certainly a different kind of effect that you get.
I can also
You're
show.
not constructing those.
Okay.
We have the last 5
Chris,
minutes.
you ready?
If anyone else has a map, they want.
Let me try to pull this
Yeah,
up.
let's get everybody in. I think I can give you the screen, Chris. What do you got?
Okay, let me share that here. So I drew, can you all see this now? I drew an initial bike ride I took way back in April, which was really at the peak of when the pandemic was hitting hardest here. I think what's interesting though about this, of course I was in the middle of all the streets here, but this could really have happened any day. And what isn't captured here is the fact that like the frame of the city was here, like the form was unchanged, but there were no people whatsoever anywhere in the city. And it's really hard to capture that kind of like organic part that you really can't see like on a static map, even if I couldn't draw that if I wanted to. So it's another interesting thing about that I'm thinking about in the context of the map room is how do you capture some of those changing moments, especially the ones that involve people, because the map of our city doesn't change day to day, but the way it feels really does. And that's a lot harder to draw.
Yeah. So a couple of things I'd like to see on top of this, like with what you talked about. I mean, we can get historical traffic data. So it's like you could see what that ride looked like the day you did it and what it would have looked like a year before, right? Like, so to see that difference is really interesting. I don't know if you know this, but there are bike counters that go that are on both the bridges. So you could also sort of see like, hey, I was one of 1,800 people who went over the bridge on one year, or I was one of 6 that did on the day that you did it. So I think those types of temporal data, I think, really give us a chance to define, because it's a line, right? That line means something to you, but how do we make it mean something to others? And so again, that brings us back to that question of annotation.
Another data set that comes to mind is data from something like Yelp about which businesses are opening up and how I think our routes through the city feel very different based on things opening and closing, or opening in different forms or extents, people using spaces in different ways. And sometimes it's so shocking, I think, going out and finding nobody there, or finding all of a sudden people there, maybe doing things that you don't approve of, or, that has really created a different kind of emotional space in the city.
Should we bring Bucky or Shivani?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
We can see you. Yeah. Do you want to hold it up, or do you want to share screen?
I just did it on my MacBook. Hold up, I'm going to share my screen. I basically just drew out the running route that I've been doing. Sorry. Okay. Can you guys see that? Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
Here we go. 1 second.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so basically the blue line here is every single day in the morning I've been running just this running route. I didn't really get much time to expand on it, but it's just kind of a way. I've been just picking this route because I know that in the morning there's not that many, joggers there around the lake. If you guys see Lake Caroline, but kind of similar to what Raya was saying earlier, this could be a great tool for people, just to see where there's a lot of traffic, like in terms of running and where there's not. So yeah, I would definitely expand it more, but I was just kind of playing around with it.
Can I ask a question because running and cycling are themes that are, and mine also was a map of going into the forest. And on mine, Shivani, I was already trying to figure out a way to notate it where I felt like, first of all, where I saw animals, but also where people were following. I'm saying something about myself here, but where people were actually following like mask guidelines and social distancing guidelines, and where people were not, like the dude who was blocking the bridge with his bike on the walking only trail and his dog off the leash with no mask for himself. Like I could take you, I've got a big red X on that spot on my map.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I wonder, like, there's so much synchronicity between like what I would have mapped and what you'd have mapped, but could you add like an interaction layer there somehow, or even like a mental layer of like where on this map you felt more or better or worse or?
Yeah, so when quarantine first started, I was trying to find different routes, and one thing that I was really focused on was, I know in the city, there's no buttons I get to press across the street, you just kind of go, but I was really trying to find routes that I didn't have to press a button to cross the street, because this is not like a park or anything. This is just a lake that's near my house that I can just run from my house every morning. It's not like, oh, here's a trail and there's woods and there's animals and stuff. My main thing was I just didn't want to have to touch anything, because I don't know if there's these everywhere, but like you got to press a button to like cross the street, and I was like, I don't really want to be touching stuff. But that's kind of one of like the main things I was looking at. I wasn't really like, oh, I want a naturey trail or something. But it was also like, okay, where can I run that has a sidewalk and that I don't have to touch anything to be able to get by?
Yeah.
That's kind of what I was really thinking about.
Right. What an interesting layer that I never would have thought of.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And I think that's kind of one of the nice things about this interface is and the way that people are using it is that you don't have to be too precious about it. It's like, do something simple, try something again. We don't spend too much time on these, and we can iterate through them, and that feels like something quite different from what we were doing previously.
Bucky, do you want to share a screen, or you have something to hold up?
Yeah, no, I'll share my screen here.
Oh, great. Okay.
I'm the only one with crayons today.
Let me see this.
I have a 4-year-old.
Screen 1. I have
Where-
2 screens. Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Okay. how
Crayons
about
are
that?
useful in
Can you-
all settings.
can you
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see the map?
Yeah, man.
I can, yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of what you were discussing, Scott. It's kind of a mental map that started where I feel safe, and then it turned into a traversing, and then I tried to overlay. So where you see the red is predominantly is kind of areas I don't feel comfortable walking around. They're commercial areas. They're kind of the like hotbeds where there's restaurants or takeout places. I just don't feel comfortable yet walking around there. To the across the river, that's Waterville, that's not Troy, across the Hudson River, and that also has some commercial areas that I wouldn't feel comfortable. And then this big red blob is RPI. Obvious reasons why I wouldn't feel comfortable at a campus of 10,000 people. But then I started to overlay some stuff. So the yellow is where I have actually been in terms of like sat, and they are my house, the Stewart's down the street, and several friends' houses in the area. And the light green area is where I've gone, like for walks, for green walks. And then once I layered that, I tried to layer in almost a sort of like a population's demographics. And so you could see North Troy and South Troy indicated in blue with different stripes. And those are kind of areas that are more predominantly from like marginalized communities. And the blue also represents like the borders of the blue where I didn't fill in were first from areas where I felt safe. And so then I mapped the dark gray area in the center, which is kind of the wider part of town, I would say, which is, of course, corresponding to the commercialized and gentrified part. And then I started to layer some other things. So you'll see a light blue arrow in the right-hand corner. That's actually the direction of the nearest grocery store, where like actual grocer that's not a bodega or a very limited shop. So that was a visualization of just how far away it is to the next grocer. Albany is indicated just to indicate kind of like how far away the sprawl would begin for that. And then I also have marked this dark green or this medium green on the left is the next, like, is pointing north towards what I would consider the next kind of batch of open green spaces. So this kind of accomplishes both the mental of where I feel comfortable, but also overlays some elements about Troy and its demographics and its geographical layout that I think are very interesting.
I think it's awesome. I think you know, the sketchiness of it, again, it's like the idea of using maps as a kind of brainstorming tool. Like, how can I use the map itself to come up with questions about what I might want to see on the map? And I love that feeling of, yeah, I almost want to be able to take these things and make notepads out of them. So there's like, now I have 30 pages of the same map that I can start drawing on and make questions about, that I think would be a really useful exercise.
I think the messiness is so important. Again, you know, I think the thing about the map room that kind of breaks all the rules. That you can, you know, when you're there, you know, with the projection and the piece of paper, you can do anything you want to that paper, and you're not restricted in terms of what the data are supposed to look like, and you can kind of scribble notes and things. And I do think it's something hard to capture without paper. I will say, but this gets close to it.
Yeah.
Wow, this is great. Thank you all. We're almost up on time, but I want to make sure people know we've been, this has been a special COVID Calls Mapping the Pandemic episode with Yanni Lukasis and Jared Thorpe, and then as well as our special in-studio guests, Shivani Patel, Bucky Stanton, Chris Pollock, and Rhea Ward. Now, before we break off, Jared and Yanni, thanks again, but also I'm going to put this link back up. And we're going to have you back in a few weeks to maybe share a bit about what people email to you. How do you want people to get in touch with you? They're going to go to this link, map.room.cov.glitch.me, if you're listening to the podcast.
Yeah. And then there's an email address there that you can send maps to. Yanni and I are both on Twitter. You can reach out to us there. And we'd love to chat, and this is all an experiment, and we're just interested in hearing from people about what these discussions provoked, about what you made and what you're thinking about. And we've always thought of MapRoom as this open space, and we want people to feel comfortable to get in there physically and like cooperatively to help us out.
And I'll just add that, you know, we're really in a time of transition now for MapRoom, as for everything. And we don't know what the future of MapRoom is going to look like. And if there are people that want to be involved in that want to try out building a new kind of MapRoom, whether it's a socially distanced MapRoom, or maybe it's a MapRoom outside where everybody stands 6 feet apart. Maybe it's a MapRoom where you have to sign up for a time to come visit it and add your layer. I think there are all kinds of possibilities, and we're looking for creative ways forward, and we'd love to work with some of you all.
I want to thank Bucky Stanton and Shivani Patel, Chris Pollock, and Rhea Ward for creating maps and just spending some time with us here today and showing us the range of creativity that people can undertake on their own, and then send these to Jer and Yanni, and we'll have them back on COVID calls in a few weeks. So, wonderful. Much more to say about all of this. I was just thinking we do transcripts, as Shivani knows very well, of the COVID calls episodes. This is going to be a particularly unique one to transcribe. We're going to have a whole map inset for this particular grouping of the COVID calls. So thanks for making the discussion really interesting today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Stay healthy, everyone. COVID calls Monday to Friday, 5 o'clock. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.